A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I've had this kink for as long as I can remember, but I didn't understand it until I was deep into adulthood, living in a cramped studio apartment in a city that never sleeps, where every night seemed to echo the whispers of 1,000 secrets. I found myself enthralled by the fantasy of becoming tiny, not just in stature but in existence, shrunk down to the size of a doll, helpless under the looming shadows of towering furniture and the vastness of the human world. It started as harmless roleplay, discovering the most absurdly designed dollhouse online and crafting it into a vivid landscape of my own imagination. As I nested inside this miniature universe, I felt a rush of liberation intermingled with terror, envisioning myself running from the dangers that were always there but scarcely recognized. I would spend hours lost in the reverie of those fantasies, where I was fragile enough to slip between the cracks of reality, sneaking around the edges of the life that hovered above me like a giant, blissfully unaware of my existence. I decorated my dollhouse, filling it with tiny furniture, assembling entire board games with pieces that resembled a grain of rice, and my world transformed. Everything glittered and shimmered with the promise of adventure, but the darker side of my yearning loomed over me like a heavy cloud. One night, after too many drinks with my roommate, I confessed my fascination, expecting laughter or ridicule, but to my surprise, she seemed intrigued. Amanda, always the bold one, suggested we take it further. What if, she said, we transformed the apartment so it felt more like my fantasy? With her help, we spent weeks rearranging furniture and filling the space with makeshift craft items tailored to my wild imagination. Together, we rigged up a tiny swing made from an old shoelace and a paperclip, and every inch of our studio became a mixed brooding and whimsical den of escape. But as the real blurred into the surreal, a feeling of dread crept in, wrapped tightly around my heart like a vice grip. It became a ritual. We'd spend dark hours in the living room, shrouded in batteries of fairy lights, constantly enhancing my escapes until they morphed into something darker, twisting once innocent games into eerie rituals that snaked their way into the fabric of our everyday life. Late one night, seeking to push boundaries, I constructed a series of mazes out of boxes and plastic wrap, fully embracing my fantasy of being pursued by ominous monsters lurking in towering shadows. It was exhilarating until something snapped inside me. The lines between fantasy and reality began to bleed. Each time I retreated into my realm, I felt a pull away from Amanda, love turning into a fraying thread beneath the immense weight of my obsession. The dollhouse kept demanding more, the stories started to overlap. I would find myself in dark corners, whispering instructions to a fading world, every object threatening me with its size and presence. Then came the night when I lost myself entirely, a blurring of self that felt like a descent into madness. Only then did I truly comprehend the fear behind the pleasure. Amanda hadn't come home for hours, and I crawled into my dollhouse, haunted by thoughts of being left completely alone. I closed my eyes in the make-believe world, wishing I could dissolve away, just evaporate. But instead, I heard something I had never anticipated, her voice, echoing from somewhere else in the apartment, an unsettling sound within the walls, heavier than all my wispy dreams. Panic gripped me as I thrust my head through the opening of the dollhouse and found her staring. I could see her lips moving, but I couldn't grasp what she said, for her gaze was locked on me, eyes wide, filled with something darker than I had ever seen. "You shouldn't have played," she murmured, and as if the air thickened with dread, I felt my world fracture. I stumbled out, everything around me warped, my heart pounding with the realization that my games had consequences I couldn't have fathomed. My apartment felt alien, shadows danced more ominously, and I swore I could almost feel the walls throb as though they were alive. Was this real? Or just the high of the fantasies I had brought to life? Amanda wasn't the same, her eyes flashed with suspicion, and every smile was laced with a worry I wasn't prepared to confront. I felt smaller with every passing day, shrinking into a frantic anticipation of the night my world would collapse under its own tomfoolery. My fantasies had spiraled into a dark hole, and I couldn't find a way out until, one harrowing evening, I returned to the dollhouse, determined to reclaim my fantasies from whatever torment they had morphed into. But when I leaned in, the world felt off. I couldn't move right, the edges of the dollhouse were jagged, sharp enough to tear the skin, and as my hands shook, I could only hear Amanda's voice echoing in the distance, a long, drawn-out whisper that began absorbing my sanity. "You should have never played." My heart raced, sensing darkness shift within the confines, an encroaching terror, and in that suffocating moment of realization, I understood that some kinks were never meant to be explored. I backed out as the shadows bloomed larger around me, swallowed by the surreal coliseum of imagination morphing into hell, and just like that, All-encompassing fear gripped me as I recognized my world was no longer a playful fantasy, but a reality where I was trapped, because, in this game, I suddenly wasn't playing anymore, I was merely prey, and out there, beyond the walls of my once beloved escape, my fate awaited. I'm tired. Today is probably going to be the day it ends. I've been saying that for weeks now, and each night I crawl into bed with a mind buzzing with despair and an unsettling sense of impending doom. But somehow, I wake up the next morning, and the clouds of exhaustion settle back in. It all started when my father disappeared nearly a month ago, vanishing without a trace on a day that seemed like any other, a Tuesday drenched in autumn rain, the kind that fills your heart with an eerie nostalgia while it washes away the colors of fall. He was just supposed to take a walk, something he often did to clear his head after long weeks buried under deadlines and obligations, but when night fell and he still hadn't returned, I felt the first tremors of fear slither through my gut. I called everyone, friends, neighbors, the local police, only for the search to yield nothing but shadows and unanswered questions. Days turned into an agonizing blur. The police treated it as a typical case of a missing adult, their sympathy waning with every passing hour. I took to wandering the woods behind our house, the place where my father loved to escape, heart pounding as I called his name into a catalog of trees shrouded in endless fog, waiting for an echo that never came. I found myself retracing his footsteps, anxiety settling in my stomach as the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. And then I saw it, a fracture in the trees, an area where the growth seemed thinner, almost intentional, and there, lying in the damp earth, was a hand-carved wooden figure of a man. It was grotesque and beautiful all at once, but more unsettling was the chill that crept up my spine, whispering that this was a sign, a distorted reflection of my father's absence. I didn't share anything about my discovery with my mother. She was already lost in her dark cloud of worry, the kind that makes every meal taste like sawdust, every laugh feel hollow. It wasn't until the days blurred into a grim cycle of hopelessness that I decided to take action, to find him before the whispers in the wind morphed into screams. I armed myself with courage, or perhaps foolishness, and a flashlight, determined to unearth the mystery I had stumbled upon with that wooden figure. As dusk rolled in, swallowing the day whole, I returned to the woods, the shadows crawling up to greet me as I turned on my flashlight and ventured deeper than ever. The trees felt like they were reaching for me, twisting in unnatural ways, as if trying to warn me. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth mixed with a sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn, and just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon an unmistakable clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient, yet something about the way its roots twisted and coiled looked almost intentional, almost inviting, as though they craved something. That's when I saw it again, the figure, this time not carved from wood but fashioned from something more horrific, something that made bile rise in my throat. It was formed from branches and leaves woven tightly together, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was not just that. It had something human beneath the foliage, a shape too familiar, too large, shrouded in darkness. My heart raced. I screamed out for my father, but the only response was the whisper of leaves brushing against each other like gossiping phantoms. As I reached out, shaking with dread, I felt a compulsion to peel away the layers of branches hugging the figure. With shaking hands, I started tugging at the leaves, terror clawing at my insides, and as the last piece fell away, my breath caught in my throat, for the figure was unmistakably my father, or what was left of him, a hollow shell, lifeless yet eerily preserved in the fabric of the forest. This was no accident, this was a design born from something dark, something deeply rooted in this very place. My tears blurred the unforgiving outline of his face as I fell to my knees, the reality of loss suffocating me. I crawled backward, heart pounding furiously, yet the woods shifted, closing in around me, and when I turned to run, I felt them, the roots tangling around my ankles, pulling me down with an unrelenting grip. I screamed, thrashing, but it felt futile. The forest roared with its treachery, and I was merely a pawn in its game. It was then that I understood, this wasn't merely a forest, it was a being hungry for sorrow, for despair, weaving the threads of humanity into its ghastly tapestry. Today is probably going to be the day it ends, and as the darkness muddied my vision, I knew that my tired spirit would soon be claimed, joining my father within the haunting web of that sinister oak. The soles of my shoes slipped against the damp earth, and with one final scream, I felt myself falling, swallowed whole by the roots that sought to claim me, and as I descended into darkness, I could only hope that no one would ever uncover the truth of what lay hidden in those woods, for it had already taken too much, and part of my weary heart remained, waiting to be lost forever in the long, echoing silence of that unholy place.
I work at a low-key diner in a small town, the kind of place that serves grease-drenched fries and all-day breakfast, where regulars come to sip overly sweetened coffee and swap gossip that echoes off the chipped linoleum. It was a job that I took out of necessity more than passion, especially since my mom had just recently fallen sick, and I had all the bills piling up at home. My coworker, Karen, is the kind of person who thrives on petty drama. She's got a knack for turning mundane requests into full-blown crises. She's also been eyeing my Wednesday morning shift, my only early day, like a hawk, but I'd made plans to take my mom to her bi-weekly therapy session, a rare opportunity for us to reconnect, as my work schedule often monopolized my life. It was during one of her endless complaints about her own commitments that she launched into a full-on crusade, convinced that I, the selfish employee, was sabotaging her chances for success. I politely declined when she first asked to swap shifts, citing my prior obligation, but that only seemed to snowball into her relentless barrage of guilt trips and passive-aggressive remarks. "You don't care about anyone but yourself," she huffed one night during closing, flicking the fryer switch off with far too much force. "Some people have real ambitions." I tried to shake off her words, but they clung to me like sweat-soaked uniforms. I thought maybe I was being unreasonable, and since people love to insist that kindness is a two-way street, I made the mistake of texting her one evening to see if we could reach some understanding, joking that I could trade my early shift for her Saturday night, which is the busiest time at the diner, hoping this would make her think twice. But Karen was relentless. She acted like I'd committed treason. Soon I was receiving messages from other co-workers, who were also under her spell, asking me why I couldn't just be a team player, to do it for the family of the diner. It started to feel like a witch hunt, but I stood firm. I couldn't lose my one chance to spend quality time with my mom. The weight of my decision hit harder one night when I overheard Karen talking in the break room, plotting ways to undermine my credibility. She painted me as the villain to anyone who'd listen, saying I was sabotaging her dreams while simultaneously tearing down my work ethic like I was the problem ruining her life. I couldn't comprehend how a simple shift swap had turned into something so twisted. Was I really the antagonist here? A part of me thought about just giving in, but the memory of my mom's face during our last appointment reminded me of what I was fighting for. A tiny but fierce part of me didn't want to grant Karen the satisfaction of having made me yield. As weeks dragged on, I noticed strange things happening. Orders would come in for tables I wasn't assigned, the ice machine would mysteriously malfunction, and patrons oohed over the burnt toast that I'd swore I never cooked. It got to a point where I almost felt like I was being bullied at my own job, a chilling sensation creeping over me that Karen had somehow turned the rest of the staff against me. One particularly chaotic Saturday, I was hit with the nausea-inducing news from my boss that I would need to take a 2-week indefinite leave due to additional training. It was a thinly veiled excuse, but I heard the laughter in Karen's eyes when I left the break room. With my heart racing, I pulled up the diner's group chat later that night, only to see Karen had shared a meme about a greedy coworker that looked suspiciously like me. The blind rage surged within me because I was sick of her games, but it wasn't until the night of my mom's treatment that everything spun out of control. Sitting in the waiting room, I suddenly received a frantic text from my coworker Sarah, warning me that Karen had taken my shift, and I knew she'd done it just to make a point. Panic gripped me, an icy hand squeezing my insides as I reflected on how low she would sink just to win a petty fight. I rushed back to the diner, yelling at the owner, but he was too mesmerized by Karen's shining performance behind the counter. I left, heartbroken and nauseated, feeling trapped in a web of everyone else's delusions. But it was that anger that eventually propelled me forward. I swore I would no longer allow anyone to dictate how I conducted my life. So with a heavy heart, I made a plan. I kept my mom's treatment notes clutched to my chest, carefully documenting every absurdity about the diner and getting to know my coworkers better. The next time I stepped in that diner, I was armed not just with memories, but intent and vengeance. It was no longer about the shift, it had morphed into a catalyst to take down a toxic work environment once and for all. As the weeks passed, I slowly began gathering support, showing my colleagues the truth behind Karen's facade, and it wasn't long before the memes and whispers flipped on her. The tides turned swiftly. She was out of the restaurant and back to being the messy, bitter person she had always been, while I finally reclaimed my time with my mom. I may have felt guilt at first for refusing to give in, but sometimes putting yourself first is the only way to stop a bigger issue. It was the hardest battle I had gone through yet, but I emerged victorious, with lessons learned, with scars that whispered reminders that no matter how vitriolic the world becomes, integrity always matters more. After all, being a team player doesn't mean losing yourself in someone else's game.
I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, but the lure of quick Steam points became an obsession I couldn't resist. You see, I was living paycheck to paycheck, my gaming habits slowly suffocating my bank account, and then, one dark evening during a particularly grueling half-hearted scroll through the gaming subreddits, I stumbled across a thread titled The Dark Side of Digital Services, where users claimed you could earn Steam points by completing increasingly bizarre tasks for anonymous clients, the kinds of things you'd never tell your friends about. Curiosity nagging at my mind, I clicked on it, and after some convincing shadowy exchanges in private messages, I found myself chatting with someone who insisted they would pay handsomely for an intimate digital experience, and while my gut twisted at the implications, my desire for the newest game release overshadowed my better judgment, so I agreed, not really understanding what it would entail. They sent me a series of instructions, a bizarre script filled with euphemisms and gamer slang, absolutely ridiculous language that felt more akin to a crude fan fiction than anything else, but the promise of 10,000 Steam points burned in my mind like a neon sign at a pitch-black intersection, leading me deeper into madness, and after exchanging a few lines of banter, I was thrusting my fingers over my keyboard in a dance of embarrassment, typing out phrases that made my face burn hotter than 1,000 suns as they sent me back more and more intense requests. And despite the ludicrousness of it all, I found myself more engaged as they would ping my overlay, turning every mundane word into a slow spiral of absurdity and titillation. But then the playful tone suddenly shifted when they began asking for personal details, a name, a location, anything that could anchor them to me. I hesitated, the weight of secrecy and shame resting on my shoulders, sensing something dark lurking just behind the curtain of the virtual world, but the allure of those points beckoned me deeper, stronger than any moral compass I might have had. And against my better judgment, I tossed out a detail or two, light and whimsical, even convincing myself it was all harmless fun. That's when the atmosphere warped, the chat abruptly turning sour as this faceless user began sending unsettling messages, demanding I validate my commitment with ludicrous claims of digital domination, culminating in a request that twisted my stomach, insisting that I literally acknowledge their control over me by performing the outlandish tasks they had in mind in some twisted livestream format, and the fear sank in. But then I saw the digits flash before me. I had exchanged the virtual for the tangible, hovering over the prompts that would unlock my points, and in the depths of indecision I acquiesced, cringing back on my desk chair, the tingling sense of dread solidifying the reality of my decision. I prepared to do something I had never imagined myself capable of, my heart racing as I reached that point of no return, anxiety mixing with utter embarrassment. But it didn't feel like I was losing my dignity as much as unraveling the essence of my humanity in front of a nameless stranger who would be able to drown my soul through electric currents and pixelated screens. And just as I finally typed the last line, the screen flickered ominously, an error message dancing angrily before me. But before I could backpedal, the last prompt appeared, covered in a sinister red hue, demanding not just the performance but the account switch as well. Suddenly, I wasn't just giving of myself digitally. I was being pulled into a web where my identity bled into pixels and lines of code, becoming a disposable identity at the mercy of some twisted puppeteer, and panic lifted me from my seat as I tried to disconnect, desperately attempting to shut down my laptop, but the screen wouldn't respond, the keys now sticky under my trembling fingers as a sinister laugh echoed through my speakers, sending chills coursing through me, heart pounding louder than the voice in my head warning me to run. It felt like the room began to swirl around me as I struggled for control. But that's when I saw it, the user presence becoming a solid ghost in the chat, an ominous series of numbers near my digital footprint, and the final message glowed incandescently, a chilling ultimatum: you wanted the points, but what are you willing to lose to keep your account? It's time to make a deal.
I wasn't the kind of guy who went around crushing the dreams of 7-year-olds, but something about my girlfriend's brother, Timmy, always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he puffed out his chest as if he were a king while wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, or the fact that he made me play against him in video games every single time I came over because he was convinced he could beat me if I just dared to try. I used to let him win. Sure, I'd play a little harder than normal, but I figured it built his confidence. Timmy was a sweet kid otherwise, always the first to offer me a cookie from his stash or show me his favorite toy, but there was something almost sinister beneath the surface of that small, innocent face. It was his relentless whining every time I beat him, the way he would stomp his foot and demand I go again, claiming I was cheating as if I were some kind of adult monster trying to ruin his childhood. I tried to laugh it off. I didn't want to diminish a kid's spirit, but when he kept taunting me about how I was never going to beat him at anything ever, I felt that familiar itch to prove a point. It was a calm Saturday evening when I finally snapped. My girlfriend was baking cookies in the other room, and the sweet, chocolatey smell wafted through the air, mixing with Timmy's cries of frustration as I scored yet another winning point. "You just let me win, didn't you?" he accused, glaring at me with those huge, innocent brown eyes that suddenly didn't seem so innocent, as if the shadows of the dimly lit room were casting a spell that twisted his features into something darker. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as something primal ignited in me, a sudden desire not just to win, but to utterly destroy his confidence right then and there. "No, Timmy, this time it's for real," I said, feeling a surge of energy course through my veins. I wouldn't just let him win, I would crush him, mercilessly. As we picked up the controllers with renewed intensity, I focused my eyes on the screen, which seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the colors flashing brighter as I dove deeper into the game. I performed moves I didn't even know I had inside me, deftly dodging every attack and countering every strategy he tried to pull. With each round I won, I expected Timmy to laugh or challenge me more fiercely, but the glow of the TV reflected in his gaze as he stared in stunned silence at the pixels that represented his rapidly fading hope. I felt exhilarated, but as his face fell, I also felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the house around us was growing colder, the walls whispering tales of the arrogance of pride and the dark side of competition. "I'm not letting you win again, Timmy. This is just how it is, and you need to understand that." The words tasted bitter on my tongue as I said them, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like a cold wave crashing onto the shore of a lonely beach, but I pushed it aside and focused on the screen. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I turned the game into a dominating disaster for him. I perfected the final move, and just as I hit the game's concluding action, the room was engulfed in darkness. The TV flickered and died, plunging us into an eerie silence, the only sound being the added stream of my own heavy breathing, and I felt every ounce of joy drain from the atmosphere as Timmy sat there trembling, his small hands clenched into fists that shook like leaves caught in a violent storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a whisper as though he was terrified of the answer. I started to reply, but that was when I noticed the lights in the house flickering strangely, almost rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in a language only the children of nightmares could understand. The shadows lengthened, extending across the walls like spectral fingers grasping for something they shouldn't have, and in that moment, I realized that the darkness had not merely consumed the television but had troubled the very foundation of our reality. Timmy's laughter turned into a wheeze as he backed away from me, terror dancing in his features, and I don't know what compelled me from that point on, but I instinctively moved toward him, wanting to make him feel safe, wanting him to understand that I was still in control. When my hand brushed against his shoulder, the air turned heavy, the atmosphere thick with something sinister, something that had been lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for just this moment to reveal itself. I thought I heard whispers, distant and haunting, echoing within my mind, and they sounded alarmingly like Timmy's voice as he gasped and said, "I just wanted to win." And I couldn't help but laugh, a short, nervous chuckle that caught deep in my throat, because it suddenly became clear that this was about more than just winning a game. This had become a matter of life and death. Then he ran. Timmy bolted for the door, screaming his lungs out, but the house felt like it closed in around me, the walls twisting and folding until I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Shadows crawled along the floor like spiders, wrapping their clammy fingers around my ankles as I stumbled forward, trying to follow him, but it was as if the house didn't want me to leave. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and there stood Timmy, wide-eyed, as if he had just caught a glimpse of something unspeakably horrifying. Blood drained from my face as dread settled in my stomach. Whatever demon had stirred inside that game was now writhing between us, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Are you mad?" he stammered as fear carved lines into his innocent face, and just when I thought I'd backed myself into a corner from which I could never escape, I heard it, an echo of laughter, warped and malevolent, that seemed to seep from the very walls, shaking them with sinister intent. That's when I knew, I had irrevocably broken something inside Timmy, something precious and innocent, and whatever darkness had awakened in that moment was now straining to escape. In that split second, I realized that I wasn't just facing the consequences of my cruel decision, I had unleashed something terrifying, a cruel shadow cast by my own hubris. A cold shiver snaked its way down my spine, as I whispered to Timmy, "I didn't mean for this to happen," but the words felt hollow and the room echoed back with an unsettling refrain, timid yet filled with a knowing horror. We stared into the face of an inexplicable fear, one that bore no physical form yet demanded to be reckoned with, and as I stood there paralyzed, I could almost feel the world fracturing beneath my feet. Those few seconds stretched long and thin, moments filled with understanding that some lines should never be crossed. I knew I needed to do something, to make amends while I could still grasp reality, but just then, Timmy's laughter resumed, only this time it sounded like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot. A boy's giggle turned cruel, echoing from the shadows that had seeped into the corners of the room. I was caught in a web of my own making, shackled by consequences, trapped in a darkness that bore witness to my mistakes, and I was left wondering if I had indeed become the monster in the children's tale I'd once considered so innocent, the very arbiter of nightmares unleashed upon this world in an unthinking act of pride.
This weekend, I'm having an abortion and I can't shake this feeling of dread that claws at my insides like a feral animal. I'm terrified, but not because of the procedure itself, no. It's the echoes of my choices reverberating through my mind that awaken the ghosts of my past. I'm already a mother, and the weight of that title can feel like an anchor dragging me down into a murky sea of desperation. The image of my daughter sleeping peacefully in her room, oblivious to the turmoil of emotions roiling within me, haunts me. I chose to keep her when I was 18, fresh out of high school and bursting with dreams, only to find out that motherhood for me is more of a prison than a sanctuary. Each year has felt more like a countdown than a gift. The joy of her little milestones eclipsed by the crushing responsibilities that suffocate my spirit. My friends tell me I'm a good mom, but what they don't see is the way guilt gnaws at my insides, the way I can't shake off the feeling that I'm failing my daughter by merely existing as a shell of the woman I used to be. 3 weeks ago, the panic set in when I found out I was pregnant again. I remember the sharp gasp I took as the test turned from 2 lines to a burning reminder of my reality, my heart racing as if I could outrun the consequences. I keep replaying the moments that led me here, the temporary lapse in sanity that resulted in a life I didn't want. It was sloppy, reckless, and I knew deep down I needed to end it before the weights of another child anchored me even further into this despair. But even as I finalize the decision, an unsettling voice whispers in the corners of my mind, asking if I'm solely doing this for myself, which makes the guilt swirl more violently, especially when I picture my daughter's bright eyes lighting up at the idea of being a big sister. Rational thoughts twist grotesquely, becoming monstrous shapes that loom over me, a constant reminder that some women would kill for the chance to cradle another life. My heart races as I scroll through an abortive forum, the raw narratives of those taking the same plunge. I only find snippets of solace in comment threads, women sharing stories of fear, heartbreak, and liberation intertwined like a chaotic tapestry. But it doesn't ease the pang of loss. I feel like I'm stepping closer to a precipice with every passing day, and the edge beckons me with its dark allure. I spend the days leading up to the appointment trapped in my own head, oscillating between anxiety and resolve. I can hardly focus on anything at all, lunches, laundry, school pickups, and for the first time, I find myself wishing the hours away, as though I can fast forward to an uncertain future because at least it signifies an end to this unbearable limbo. My mother's voice echoes whenever I dare to think about discussing my choice with her. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. Her judgment hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the memories of how she always seemed disappointed in my choices, so how could I possibly tell her this? It sends shudders down my spine, bringing the tight knot of fear back to my throat. The night before the procedure, I lay in bed, staring into the dark. It swirls with unfamiliar shapes and shadows that seem to mock me, whispering, "You are going to regret this." I check the time again, 3:02 a.m. I can't help but think about the what-ifs. What if I go through with it and regret it later? What if I somehow lose this child and never forgive myself? It's an agonizing loop that steals my sleep, and somehow, as I watch the dawn creep in through my window, I start to wish I had never seen that pregnancy test in the first place. I think perhaps it's the fact that I can feel the weight of other women's suffering echoing through me, and it's horrifying. The hours crawl, each tick of the clock feeling like a drumbeat in my chest, signaling my impending choice. The morning of the procedure blurs as I dress and collect my thoughts. However, just before my appointment, I receive a message from a friend, congratulatory and innocent. She doesn't know yet. "Hey! You should tell your daughter she's going to be a big sis." My heart lurches painfully at the thought. I want to scream and cry, to push away the looming fate that's just ahead, yet it only solidifies the fear that has grown thick and suffocating deep within me. When I finally arrive at the clinic, the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, blinding and sterile, and the waiting room is filled with a mix of tension, sadness, and an unsettling camaraderie, as if we're all private members of a club of despair, each woman clutching her heartache beneath the surface. I sit there, feeling disassociated as I stare at the posters on the wall promoting women's health. They seem so jovial, speaking of choice and empowerment, yet here I am, crushed beneath the weight of my own choices. When they finally call my name, I feel a wave of nausea wash over me, intertwined with a sense of inevitability, and as I move toward the narrow hallway, I can't help but wish more than anything for this opportunity to vanish and for me to be free of my own decisions. The doctor is kind but detached. She speaks in soothing tones that feel oddly clinical, and I keep reminding myself of the reasons I'm there, the relief I'll feel afterward. But amidst it all, in the sharp tang of antiseptic, my memories come alive, the sweet laugh of my daughter, the feel of her small hand gripping mine, the way she looks at me as if I am her entire world, and a sudden wave of panic hits me. What if this is my last chance? As the procedure begins and the world falls silent around me, I feel the terror building within. It's as though I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into an abyss where every failed option and unmade choice lie festering like wounds. And as I close my eyes, tears streaming down my cheeks, I try to remember why I'm here and breathe deeply into the fear, hoping that somewhere within this harrowing moment, amidst the chaos of the choices I've wrestled with, I can unearth the strength that has eluded me for so long before I plunge headlong into the darkness. I take quick selfies when taking pictures for strangers, and it seems innocuous enough. After all, I'm just a guy with a camera, trying to make the most of my weekends by helping lost tourists capture memories, but something changed that day when I decided to take a photo for a couple at a park festival. They looked so happy, the sun catching the gleam in the woman's eyes, and as I raised my phone to snap the picture, I felt a sudden rush of unease. I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker just behind them, but when I glanced back, there was nothing but fading autumn leaves spinning in the wind. I brushed it off, focusing through the camera lens to frame the couple perfectly against the vibrant backdrop of the festivities, and when I handed them my phone, their gratitude was genuine, or at least I thought it was until later that night when I scrolled through the pictures and noticed something uncanny. In the background of their photo, just at the edge of the frame, there it was, the same shadow I thought I'd imagined, a dark, elongated figure with limbs that seemed too long, twisting, almost like they weren't bound by human anatomy, and I felt a chill trickle down my spine. Trying to shake off the feeling of dread, I went to bed, but when I tried to sleep, my mind kept replaying the jittery image as I whispered reassurances to calm myself down, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light or a passing person that I didn't notice, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't help but feel that whatever that thing was, it had been looking right at me. It gnawed at me through the night until I finally decided to go back to the park the next day, just to be sure, just to prove to myself that it was nothing. And with a sense of false courage, I arrived at the bustling festival, my camera swinging at my side, but the moment I walked in, a heavier, indescribable weight settled on my chest. People laughed, children played, and the laughter of families rang out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and it took only an hour of awkward, nervous wandering before I was overwhelmed by the pull of my curiosity. I began capturing more photos of unsuspecting strangers, each time making a quick selfie to document my existence within the day. But every picture came back to me with that same shadow lurking ominously in the background, like a harbinger of dread waiting patiently for something, stalling within the edges of every frame and breaking my spirit little by little. By now, I couldn't function properly. I could feel an urgency drumming in my veins, compelling me to investigate the meaning behind this obsession that had taken root in my thoughts until I stumbled upon a woman selling homemade remedies in a makeshift stall. Her eyes bright yet burdened with a depth of knowledge that sent a shiver down my spine as if she was privy to secrets I could never fathom. I approached her hesitantly, feeling foolish for even asking, but I told her about the shadowy figure and how it seemed to be connected to my pictures. To my surprise, she simply smiled condescendingly, as if she were an unsuspecting mother amused by a child's imaginary friend, and she spoke of ancient folklore in a voice that was both soothing and sinister, claiming that shadows like mine are not mere figments but echoes of energy, remnants of souls trapped between the living and the lost. Panic surged through me as I tried to explain that I was just trying to help people preserve their memories, but she cut me off, telling me that sometimes when you capture a moment, you also invite whatever is lurking within it to cross over, to attach itself to you, and all the while I felt my heart racing out of control as she pressed a small, black stone into my palm, telling me it would protect me if I truly wanted to rid myself of the entity that had latched onto me. I thanked her, feeling foolish and grateful in equal measure, and as I left the festival that day, I started to feel the oppressive weight lift ever so slightly, convinced that maybe I had overreacted and that the remedy would shield me from whatever malignant force had been haunting me, but instead, that night, I started having the most vivid dreams. I found myself standing in the park again. Only it was dark, and the festival lights twinkled in a disorienting manner, illuminating strangers who were now twisted and ghastly, their faces distorted and unrecognizable as they seemed to dance around me in a frenzy. I turned to run, but before I could make it out, the darkness didn't chase me away, it wrapped around me like a warm blanket, drawing me in, and I could feel the shadow tightening its grip, whispering things I couldn't understand but resonated deep within my core, filling me with rage and despair, until I bolted upright in my bed, gasping for air. My phone buzzed insistently on my nightstand, and it took me a moment to find my bearings. It was a message from the couple, the very ones I had taken the initial photo of, and they thanked me again with a nudge of nostalgia, but out of nowhere, they asked if I noticed anything strange in the pictures, and before I could respond, they sent me a screenshot, a grainy image from the festival where I had taken their picture, but it wasn't the same shadow anymore. This one was gleaming by the edge of their hair, and now it had an undeniable form, a face with hollow eyes and a gaping maw, as though it had only just begun to crawl its way out of the realm between life and death. And in that moment of terror, I dropped my phone in disbelief, realizing all too late that I had not only taken a picture for them, but that I had unwittingly signed a pact. My selfies were no longer just innocent snapshots, they had become a portal, a call to something ancient and dark, and as I stood frozen, staring into the void of my dimly lit room, the shadows crept closer, creeping in with a deadly certainty, and I trembled in realization, knowing that I might have just sealed the fate of all those I had photographed, lost to the inescapable darkness beneath the flickering sun.
I've been living with my foster parents for almost 3 years now, and when they first took me in, I felt a flicker of hope after the chaos of my biological family, but that hope quickly fizzled out like a cheap candle. They were nice at first, taking me to parks and letting me choose my favorite meals, but little by little, they began imposing rules that felt suffocating, especially when they decided that they had the right to put parental controls on my iPhone, the one my biological parents gave me before everything went south. That phone was a lifeline. It held pictures of my real mother laughing with me at the beach, messages from my father that said he'd always love me no matter what, and even a few voicemails I kept because they felt like echoes of a past life I couldn't fully remember. When my foster parents broached the subject of parental controls, suggesting it was for my safety, maybe even to protect me from myself after they caught me watching some videos that spiraled into dark territory, I was furious. It felt as if they were digging a grave for my memories, trying to erase everything I had left of my real family. My fists clenched as I remember their voices, calm, yet deceptively firm, telling me it was for my own good. I felt small and powerless as they explained how the internet was a dangerous place, filled with shadows lurking behind every click, as if I'd somehow be safe behind their so-called protective measures. But I'd rather risk it all, dive headfirst into a digital abyss than let them erase the last remnants of my past. I protested, argued, even begged, and when that got me nowhere, I went quiet and resolved to keep my phone a secret from them, using it late at night, crouched under my blanket with the screen dimmed to avoid detection. I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of dark web forums and conspiracy theories, where like-minded souls gathered to share their secrets and fears, convincing myself that they understood the depths of my grief far better than anyone in my foster home ever could. On those sleepless nights, I discovered far more than I ever wanted to know, stories of people who had lost loved ones, tales of sinister disappearances, and whispers of a dark underbelly that thrived in the forgotten corners of the internet. I didn't realize how consumed I was becoming until I encountered a user named Shad0W who claimed he could help people cross over and re-establish contact with the dead using only technology. I was skeptical but intrigued by this account. He had a strange allure, a quiet confidence that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I began engaging with his posts, my curiosity overriding my alarm bells, convinced that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to communicate with my parents again, to hear their voices one last time. Shad0W claimed he needed a special device, the type of thing used in the old ghost hunting shows and a few creepy YouTube channels. I had never considered going beyond my phone, but Shad0W assured me that he had the secrets to make my iPhone a portal, a tether to the world I lost touch with. With his encouragement, I snuck out one moonless night to grab the necessary supplies, a broken radio, a battery pack, and several wires from the old electronics my foster parents tossed out. I felt a thrill run through me as I pieced it together in my room, convinced that while the world saw darkness, I was simply on the brink of a glorious rebirth. As I wrapped the last wire around the makeshift contraption, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I set everything up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, hoping this wouldn't just be another wild goose chase. I wanted to believe it would bring me closure. As the clock struck midnight, I opened a chat window with Shad0W, typing frantically, my fingers almost slipping over the screen from the sweat of my anticipation. He told me to make a noise, anything, and focus on the memories I still cherished, the laughter of my real mother and the promises of my father echoing like whispers in my mind. I followed his instructions, my breath hitching as I began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. And then, as I held my breath waiting for something, anything, the air around me crackled to life. At first, it was silence, and I thought I was being foolish, but then the radio I'd fashioned let out a high-pitched squeal that made me recoil, and the lights flickered as if responding to my intentions. My phone screen began to blur, the images of my parents rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Suddenly, I heard static, followed by indistinct voices, growing louder and clearer. It was my mother's laughter and my father's deep chuckle weaving together in a painful symphony. I reached out, desperate to bridge the gap, to connect to the only family I'd ever truly felt was mine. As I continued to hum, the voices grew frantic, and an icy chill crawled up my spine, a sense of urgency twisting in my gut. And then, just like that, a voice that wasn't my mother's erupted through the static. "Stop it. Please stop." It was low, plaintive, almost begging, and the warmth of hope quickly twisted into something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat as the tone shifted, becoming furious, accusing me as if it were a vengeful spirit. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart raced, dread pulsing through me as I realized I might have done something horribly wrong, awakening something I could never comprehend. I tried to pull back, to disconnect, but I was paralyzed as shadows began to stretch along the walls, writhing and shifting like dark bile. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, whispers flooding my ears, growing louder. "You're not family. You're not family." Fleeing into panic, I threw my phone across the room, shattering the fragile link, the echoes of their fury clawing at my skin. The shadows receded, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence, but the scar of that encounter would never vanish. I stumbled into the living room in a haze, my heart still pounding as I faced my foster parents, who woke up alarmed by the commotion. Their eyes widened as they saw me, trembling and wide-eyed, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their concern, genuine and terrified, yet I could hardly stand it. They immediately gathered around me, asking questions I didn't know how to answer, probing for an explanation of what had transpired in the dark corners of my mind. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had desperately sought solace and instead summoned only trouble, but the words stuck in my throat. The fear in their eyes stung like 1,000 needles, and just like that, I realized I had no choice. I had insulted my own reality, tearing apart the fragile threads of stability they had attempted to weave around me. As they held me, their warmth was suffocating instead of comforting. It only reminded me of the loss, the real family lost in shadows and confusion. I didn't want them probing deeper, I didn't want to tell them what happened. But that night turned from chaos to something else. It morphed into quiet nights full of investigations into my behavior, full of therapy openness and communication strategies over therapy sessions. They came to discover the extent of my misadventures on the internet and decided to enforce parental controls, the very thing I had fought against, drowning me in an irony bitter enough to make me sick. With each layer they placed on my phone, I felt not protected, but restrained, confined within the walls of their good intentions, a prisoner to their version of safety. My biological family was gone and unreplaceable, and somehow, my foster family turned from bastions of hope into an extension of confinement. I began to wonder, AITA, for trying to cling to the last pieces of my past, for wanting a connection that, as the dreadful echoes of that night reminded me, perhaps ought to remain severed, void of voices calling from the dark. I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity. My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features, as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. AITA for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. I never thought my life would take the turn it did that fateful evening when I decided to clear out our daughter's bedroom. I stood in the doorway, heart racing, staring at the colorful walls plastered with unicorn stickers that she loved so much, a room frozen in her laughter and brightness, but now haunted by my husband's betrayal, a betrayal I had stumbled upon just weeks before, his late-night texts, his reckless disregard for our family, and the undeniable evidence of an affair that birthed a child they never intended for me to know. But I knew everything. Still, those long sleepless nights consisted of perfecting my revenge, and the twisted sense of justice motivated me to pack up her life as if I was merely returning a borrowed possession to a long-lost friend. I remembered the day she was born, how I had cradled her tiny body in my arms, promising her eternal love and protection, and suddenly, I felt this primal urge to shield her from the disgrace of her father's actions, and so that night, I made the trek to the attic and retrieved the boxes marked with her name, stuffed animals, art supplies, those crayon-drawn pictures that once adorned our fridge, items that brought joy now felt like reminders of her father's betrayal. I marched to her room, emptying shelves, packing them meticulously, as if with every toy I stuffed into the box I could erase the memories of his infidelity, feelings of rage coursing through my veins as I imagined his other child, the one from the affair, unpacking her things in my sacred space, living a life in our home where my daughter's spirit once thrived. How dare he think he could bring that child into our world as though nothing had changed? I loaded my car with the boxes that night, my heart pounding, the weight of my decision clinging to my chest. The thought of her father coming home to find nothing but stark walls staring back at him was too delicious to resist. I drove to my parents' house, a place where I had grown up, their cozy warmth suffocating me in nostalgia as I lugged in the boxes, determined to secure a part of my daughter's happiness where no one could touch it, wrapping it in the safe confines of love, and calling my parents to let them know the crazy plan I was enacting. They were concerned but ultimately supportive, especially after hearing the tremor of betrayal in my voice, the elements of sadness seeping through the cracks of my resolve. The weeks that followed were restless, amplifying my anxiety when I finally decided to confront him. His apologies rang hollow as he described how life just happened, and the words tore through me, shattered glass echoing in the vacant spaces of my heart. I could feel the cracks form as he pleaded with me to just give everything a second chance, to welcome him back into my arms and our daughter's life, an opportunity I knew I could never grant. Instead, I threw the boxes down around him, each one thudding against the floor with the weight of our broken dreams, hexing him with my furious stare. I told him I'd already done the heavy lifting. He would have nothing left of her, nothing left of peace for the child that had stolen my life. He gasped, his face morphing into disbelief, anger bubbling within those hazel eyes I once loved. But I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I hung up the phone after declaring it was done, a calm overtaking me as I drove back to my parents' place to tuck my daughter into bed. And the next day, I received a call that turned my world further upside down. A mixture of disdain and pity filled my stomach as I learned about his plans to contest the arrangement, claiming that I was being unreasonable, uprooting her life further into chaos, twisting my act as malice rather than a mother's attempt to protect the sanctity that remained of our family. A loaded gun and a duel awaited. The stakes were high as whispers of the affair child began surfacing. Drama unfolding in circles I never intended to find myself in, my small town filled with scrutiny and judgment as I became the center of attention. The child was so innocent, I understood, but the way my husband was telling the story twisted everything about who I was. I was the villain now, the sinner who sought revenge on a child who knew nothing, and yet, I was right. It was an emotional roller coaster that left my heart wearied and precariously balanced as I battled courts for custody, justified my choices in front of their distorted glares, and braced for the war that would ensue when the affair child's mother decided to step forward, her blood-curdling screams echoing in the depths of my mind when she confronted me about taking their belongings, accusing me of silently cruel intentions as if I was the one who betrayed, as if I pulled the trigger first. It was easy to hate her as she bounced behind the emotions of being denied happiness, as I reminded myself she chose this life, while I had committed to ours. But things began to change when I heard my daughter whisper hauntedly through the air while she played with friends, "Is my room still there?" Maybe the futility of my actions were now painful in ways I hadn't anticipated as I realized I wasn't only uprooting my husband and the child he sired, but I was silently ripping apart my little girl's foundation, and that thought dug in. So a week passed, and I stood at my former home, staring at the pallid door, and my heart cracked open even wider. I bellowed open the front door, the darkness of the hallway overwhelmed me, and there it was, that echo of laughter carried down the walls, but no longer were they filled with her joy. My heart raced as I ventured past the living room to vanish into my daughter's realm of colors, and in that instant, I felt like a ghost. The furniture moved around so starkly it was as if I could feel nothing but despair seeping through the cracks, and what awaited was a mere glimpse of those toys that I had left behind. They remained discarded, callously tossed without care, and the sheer thought of my daughter being replaced by a child who should have never existed in this place stirred something inside me. It hit me then, I wasn't making a point, I was simply hurting an innocent.
As a kid, I always loved my little brother, Ben, more than anything else in the world. He had this sweet, innocent smile and a giggle that could light up a dark room, but bedtime was always a chore for him. Every night he was terrified of the dark, of shadows lurking in the corners, and I would always let him crawl into bed with me just to soothe him. But soon, a strange dynamic began to form, as he started sleeping more and more in my bed while our parents were unaware, believing I was being a good big brother and watching out for him. But deep down, I wasn't just comforting him. There were whispers every night that crawled under my skin, whispers that only Ben seemed to hear, and it started innocently enough with him waking me up in the middle of the night, eyes wide and trembling, convinced he saw something by the window or a sinister shape in the corner of the room. He would point, and I'd assure him there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows, and I'd pull him close, his tiny body shaking against mine as I told him stories about brave knights and daring dragons to drown out the echoes of whatever haunted him. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at my nerves, until one fateful night when Ben sat up abruptly and stared wide-eyed into the midnight darkness, his little voice trembling as he said with an eerie certainty that there was a man standing at the foot of my bed. My heart dropped. I bolted upright, flipping on the lamp, scanning the room, but there was nothing, just the hollow silence of our old house. I tried to pass it off as a dream or an imagined fear, but as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the hairs on my neck prickling with unease. So I wrapped an arm around my brother, feeling his breathing steady against my side, hoping to calm him and myself. But no matter how much I told myself it was all in his head, the truth was that something was very wrong, and that wrongness was growing. Over the next few weeks, the nightmares escalated, with Ben waking me nightly, talking about the man, his description twisted and bleak. He had no face, just a gaping void where features ought to be, and his voice was something we could never hear. Yet it echoed in the back of our minds like a heavy bell tolling in a distant land, and while I dismissed his fears at first, laughing as if it was all part of childhood imagination, I couldn't ignore the impact it had on him. He was losing weight, his eyes growing dark and sunken, and I started to become terrified for him. But every time I questioned him about it, he only told me that the man wanted him to go with him, and that night, I made a decision. I would take charge and protect my brother, so I devised a plan to stay vigilant, to keep Ben close and ward off whatever darkness loomed over him. But that night, I did something I never thought I would. I fell asleep. The warmth of my brother sprawling across my side felt like safety. But I woke. With a start to silence, everything was eerily still as I reached out to find Ben. He was gone. Panic set in as I jumped off the bed, rushing to his room, tossing on the light, but it was empty. My heart raced as I circled the house, calling out for him frantically until I finally found him in the living room, staring blankly toward the hatch to the attic. My gut churned as I approached him, noticing the way he stood rigid, eyes glowing with a strange light, and when I called his name, he turned, but it wasn't my brother looking back at me. There was a hollow emptiness in his features, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just a cruel imitation of the Ben I knew, and my heart dropped as he said in an oddly distanced voice, "He told me I could come play," before he abruptly turned and began to crawl toward the attic door, and I grasped his arm, desperation clawing at my throat, pulling him toward me. But as I did, a cold wind swept through the room, and the whispers danced around us like a chilling dance, tearing through my sanity, and as Ben's grip loosened, I realized with horror that he was listening to it, drawn like a moth to a flame, and I could feel the air shifting as a darker presence enveloped us, pressing against my chest, urging me to let go, to succumb to whatever promised my brother sweet dreams and dark fantasies. But it was a lie, I knew that. I yanked him back into my arms, as tight as I could, begging him to remember who he was, who we were, but the look in his eyes was one of dull acceptance, and in that moment, I felt the last of his warmth slip away, snatched by something beyond my comprehension, and the next thing I knew, his tiny body was gone, dissolved like mist into the gathering shadows, leaving me alone standing in the grip of whatever nightmare had claimed him, its smothering presence wrapping around me, pulling me into darkness. And as I stood there, shivering in the heaving silence of the house, I understood too late that I had failed him. My little brother, the one I'd promised to protect, had traded me for something far worse, and as the shadows danced ever closer, I realized there was a reason he had been terrified of the dark, a reason he needed my bed. It was never just about fear, it was about something lurking that fed off that fear, something that made it feel safe to lead him away. And as realization washed over me, I turned, looking up at the attic, Knowing there was no choice left, there was only one way to save my brother now, one horrifying truth waiting for me to confront. But deep down I also knew that whatever I faced up there would change me forever, and as I took that first step up the creaky stairs, a whisper followed, coiling around my mind like smoke, saying, "Join us."